I'm Jim Knight, co-founder of the Instructional Coaching Group, and you're listening to Coaching Conversations, where I talk with coaching experts from around the world so that all of us can learn better ways to make an unmistakably positive impact on the people around us. Well, I'm super excited to be talking to Dr. Richard Boyatzis, whose work has profoundly influenced my thinking on change. Now, I'm just going to mention a few books, but I wanted to show you this one, which was my first encounter with your work, this Primal Leadership book, which you wrote with Daniel Goleman. If I was to make a list of the 10 greatest leadership books I've read, maybe even top 5, this would be in there. This is such a great book.
Wow. Thank
And I was turned on to it by Dennis Sparks, who used to lead an organization called Learning Forward, was the National Staff Development Council. And he held it up in a meeting and he said, "This is the best book on leadership I've ever read." And when I heard him, I was all in. So I think this is just a fantastic book. Then I read Helping People Change, which really is parallel to many of our thoughts about change, as I've talked about different things. And then your most recent book, The Science of Change, which I think is anybody who's in change, which is probably just everybody should be reading this. You want to understand change. You spent decades studying change, and I'm so excited to have you here and talk about your intentional change theory and a few other things. And my plan is to limit myself to about 20 minutes of questions, then tell you about this thing we call our change model called the impact cycle. And then I want your blunt, truthful responses to everything I explain. I want to be a different man at the end of this conversation because of what we talk about. So that's my...
nothing like setting the standards low.
Right. And then if we get a little jazz guitar in there at the end, that would be nice. We'll quote a little Wes Montgomery. That'd be great. In your work, you talk about 10 different principles in the science of change, 10 different principles. I want to touch on just a few to sort of open the door of the conversation, and then feel free to direct the conversation if you think I'm missing something important. But you talk about starting with the ideal self. Could you say a bit more about that? I'm really curious about that.
For decades, we have had in any of the professional fields, any of them, education, medicine, management, dentistry, all of them. Actually, not any, all of them. We've had the assumption that specific goals motivate change. And, SMART goals took off in the late 60s and ran rampant. I go through in the new book a part of that history, because I was a part of that history in the 60s, as to why it got so strongly embedded. And I even published a study in 1970 with Dave Kolb showing that if you set specific goals, you likely changed more. But there was something wrong with what we were thinking about. And what was wrong didn't come about. I started to feel it and sense it during the 90s, listening to adults I was working with. And it finally struck me really hard around 2000. And then we've spent part of the next 15, 20 years doing fMRI, neuroimaging studies to really test this. And the learning is that specific goals not only don't motivate change, they close you down to it. And part of it is the timing, not that goals aren't useful, but you don't want to start with them, because neurologically, a goal literally focuses your attention. I mean, it brings you from 180-degree peripheral vision down to 30 degrees. That's its goal. I mean, that's its aim, is to help you focus your energy. The problem is when you want to open a process of exploring, learning, or change, you want the opposite. You want to open a person up. So what became very clear was that even though I had thought, and Dave Kolb and I had predicted, that this real ideal self discrepancy was really motivating of change in the late 60s, it isn't. What's the motivator of change is the vision, the dream, the sense of purpose, the sense of meaning, the big picture. And we have the fMRI data now to prove that, that if you get people talking about what their ideal life would be like, if you literally get them to break with reality and dream, that they open up, and they open up to new ideas, and other people, including you or whoever is that's talking with them. And when it comes to the difficult process of learning or changing anything, which is fraught with a lot of what I call negative emotional attractor, stress, because you have to. I mean, you're using a lot of emotional self-control. That if you don't replenish the energy or the excitement about the change process, you exhaust it very quickly. I mean, we know training programs in industry and government have what's been called since the early 70s the honeymoon effect. 3 weeks to 3 months afterwards, it's all gone. And we know the retention of anything from a graduate course is 6.5 weeks. So the question is not just how do you open a change process, but how do you keep it going? And that's where the vision, I call the ideal self, but it is a person's sense of purpose, legacy, calling, meaning, and embedded with their values and philosophy and embedded with their identities with a healthy dose of hope that I think creates that juice that helps us to refill the energy that we're using up in pursuing a change.
You're already making me rethink my ideas. So I love this a lot. Now, in schools where we work most of the time, we also work a little bit with surgeons and work a little bit with positive health coaches and the Royal College of Surgeons. But most of our work is in education. And it's often the case that a principal will tell a teacher, this is your goal. This is what you need to work on. How optimistic are you about that goal? This is a bit of a leading question, but how optimistic are you about somebody being told this is the goal you have to do?
It is an absolutely efficacious process if what you're trying to do is vomit on somebody and punish them. In that process, that principal is being what we would call a helping bully.
Oh, that's
he,
a great.
she or they are having not just no impact on motivating the teacher they're talking to, they're reversing the impact. They're
Right.
almost ensuring that the person will not pursue that. And part of that is the role of feedback. I mean, we continue to think feedback is central to people changing. It isn't. Most of the time, people don't listen anyway. And most of the time, even if they, if a teacher was sitting in the principal's office and the principal's saying something like that, what the teacher's doing is sitting there saying, "Oh yes, thank you, sir," or "Madam, that's very helpful." So, I mean, part of what I feel is that feedback is only useful in a change process if the person genuinely asks for it. And I've got to say that seldom happens because we spend so much time making people feel guilty or defensive in setting up the change. And healthcare is the same thing. Why is treatment adherence 50% worldwide for everything done? Except my cardiothoracic surgeon students tell me that treatment adherence for coronary bypass surgery is 20%. So why do people not do the things to get better? I think it's because the physicians and the nurses try to scare the crap out of them when they describe what's happening. And as soon as you scare somebody, you're punching them.
Right.
And the human organism will go into a defensive mode. And part of that defensive mode is to stop listening. So I think that principle has just ensured that that teacher will not only not change, but that teacher will probably start spending more of their creative energy fantasizing what else they could do with their life.
Let me just point out that you're one of the world's leading experts on change. You've studied change for 50 plus years. And what
Yeah,
you're
60 actually. Yeah.
I didn't see how that was humanly possible looking at you on the video. But anyway, first off, telling people what to do is not a effective way of bringing about change. And then I would say, and I was really influenced by Keegan Leahy's book a long time ago,
Right.
how the way we talk affects the way we work. The assumption that there's only one right answer, and I know the right answer, and so I'm going to tell it to you. And how lucky you are that I can tell you this one right answer that I figured out. Traditional model of feedback.
I mean, you held up our helping people change work. Well, Melvin Smith and I started talking it was, yeah, I think in 2003, we started to use the label for the approach that we were discovering and advocating in when coaching with people, whether as a professional coach or as a teacher, helper, manager, whatever. And we called it coaching with compassion, which is really coaching to that person's dreams
Right.
or values, not yours. And we call the opposite, which is the most typical, coaching for compliance, where I'm coaching you. I'm trying to get you to do what I think you should do. And, that's like your in-laws telling you how to dress your kids, which is annoying when they're 6, but it's really insulting when your kids are 50. So what this coaching for compliance, like I said, I used the term just before, the recipient actually feels like they're getting bullied. And the human mind and spirit does not positively respond to that.
It's dehumanizing. Yeah, absolutely. I'm with you all the way.
And part of this other theme that you just mentioned, Jim, that I think is very important. Right now around the world, there is this surge of populism. And
Right.
very often, if people have various derangement syndromes,
Right.
they're assuming that populism is uneducated and emotional pandering. There's another way to look at it, which is that the current form of elitist control is, in fact, coaching for compliance, where a small number of people say, well, we're the experts. We know what's good for you. And by the way, you should give up control, give us your money, and we'll do what's better for you. That government philosophy that has reigned supreme in many countries of the world right now is seeing a ground surge of people saying, I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure all these policy experts are all that thoughtful about what my needs are.
So many thoughts I've got. One of them is we have, and I've talked to quite a few people about this, an impulse for certainty. We want to feel
Right,
things
right.
certain, and hence populism becomes attractive because it may not be a good solution, but at least it's certain. Um, but our approach has been really influenced by motivational interviewing and the idea of helping a teacher, whoever our collaborator is we're working with, pursue the goal they really want to pursue. And what we're doing is we're providing all the support we can to help them go after the thing that
Yep,
matters to them.
right.
And we would say that's a change in kids. We set a goal around the change in kids. Tell me about, if you don't mind, the PEA and the NEA. I think that's a really, really key concepts.
It became clear to me because I started the very first study on change and how to help it in the spring of 1967.
Mm.
And yeah, I was still an undergraduate, but that was the semester I'd come back from working as an um, aerospace engineer scientist at Northrop for 5.5 months, with the absolute belief that although I'd wanted to be in the space program my entire life, because I needed corrective lenses in 1966, they wouldn't allow me to be in space. And that meant that I was destined to spend all of my time sitting computer programming and occasionally flying out to a secret air base and, kicking tires on space vehicles or space planes. But at any rate, from that study on, it became very clear that um, the ways we tried to help on the whole were misguided. We looked for a hero. You talked about certainty. Um, I wrote a whole paper after do a thematic analysis of audio tapes of the original Lone Ranger radio show from the 30s on how a lot of our myths in the US about helping were based on the Lone Ranger concept, where somebody would come in, solve it. We wouldn't even know who they were because they wore a mask. And
Right.
just before we could thank them, they'd ride away. Um, I think all too often we still do that. We turn to medication for solving our problems when it could be lifestyle or nutrition.
Right.
I don't know about solving problems, but helping a lot.
Treat the,
So I'm sorry.
just treat the symptom, not the problem.
Yeah, that's right. Anyway, what became clear as I spent a good deal of time in the 70s doing psychotherapy with alcoholics and drug addicts based on the early stages of intentional change theory was that people needed something to interrupt not just their mental flow, but their psychophysiology. Because most of the time, our hormones are ruling kind of how we're thinking about things. And because they work so fast, and you're talking about, we didn't know at the time in the 70s, but now after 2000, we know that human brains stimulate directly other human brains in 8 to 40 thousandths of a second. That's way below consciousness and with their actual feelings, and not what you think you're showing, and not what you may be even aware of or not aware of, but actually what's going on. So all of a sudden, the question is, what happens in these moments where, we used to say you're talking and all of a sudden a student, a client, a patient has an aha moment. And that's when I started to think that we had to appreciate something that, from my work at MIT on my specialty was control systems of interplanetary vehicles, is all of that stuff was all assuming nonlinearity and discontinuities. In the social sciences, that was still unheard of. But clearly things were not happening evenly or smoothly or in a linear fashion. And the implication, for example, in any helping relationship, is that you may work on something with someone for days or weeks. And when it pops to that person, you can't tell. And it doesn't mean that, I used to use the comment that if I'm working with a whole bunch of geeks or nerds, they don't become, 5% more empathic each day. They don't have 5% more eye contact each day. Some days they're totally out of it, and other days they really build a rapport. So when you notice that there are these moments of emergence where something pops, something has to tip into that. And the concept out of complexity theory, which wasn't really articulated that well in the 70s, but by the 80s, people started to talk about it, were tipping points. And, like when you're dropping the temperature, the tipping point in the nature of water changes at 32 degrees. The liquid becomes a solid. So the question is, what are those tipping points in the process of change? And as I was exploring that with various colleagues and doctoral students and all that, it became very clear that, first of all, you had to understand the tipping point in a human psychophysiologically. You couldn't just do it psychologically. You had to account for neural activations, which are happening, like I said, in thousands of a second, and hormonal activations, which are happening a little slower, but have a much longer effect. And that's when I started to realize that it's not like people resist change. I think that's a bad label. It misdirects our energy. It's that people are drawn to another thing. And that's where I started using what Ed Lawrence called strange attractors, not other kind, that kind of pull you to them like the sun pulls a planet around it. And I hypothesized, and I was teaching a graduate course in the School of Engineering on systems and complex systems. That's where I hypothesized that inside of each one of us were a positive and negative emotional attractor. Now, it has become very clear, as we've done a lot of research on this, that the positive emotional attractor is being, well, let me start with the negative, actually, it's easier. The negative emotional attractor is being in a stress state, sympathetic nervous system arousal, and actually activating the task positive network, which is an analytic network in your brain. And you tend to frame things negatively. Whereas the positive emotional attractor is being in the parasympathetic, what I call for shorthand renewal state, hormonal state, and activating the empathic network, which is really the default mode neural network. And you tend to look at things positively. And these are huge differences. It's the difference between looking at things as possibilities versus problems, hope versus fear. One that's very popular is optimism versus pessimism. And of course, people who are optimists call themselves optimists. People who are pessimists call themselves realists. So what we have shown now in our psychophysiological studies is that when you appeal to or stimulate the positive emotional attractor, people are open to a new idea. They're open to another person, and they're open to emotions. When you stimulate the negative emotional attractor, people get very focused, they get very analytic, and they close down because they get into a defensive mode. Now, you need both. You wouldn't have woken up today if you didn't stimulate what I call the NEA. And to decide whether or not you want Chinese or Italian food for dinner, you need the NEA. And we need it. We use it to solve problems, to analyze things. But to put it simply, stress is useful but bad for you. And there's no such thing as good stress. I mean, if you talk to somebody who says, oh, there's eustress or whatever, they're an idiot. They don't understand the human body. And the human body doesn't matter what culture, gender, race, it doesn't matter. The human body works the same way. So to put it simply, what we've learned from all these different studies is that sustained desired change starts in the positive emotional attractor. Now, inevitably, I'm
Sorry, go
sorry?
ahead. Well, I was just going to say, hence the ideal self.
That's right, because that's one way to stimulate the positive emotional attractor.
Right.
There are other ways, but that's one way.
Right.
And because the change process or learning anything is negative at times, because you have to work at it. It's not always easy. You have to exercise emotional self-control. All of those things stimulate the NEA so that periodically you have to get another boost, if you will, of energy. Because what happens is the feeling is that when you're in an NEA state, like you're working hard at something, your energy level is deflating.
Right.
When you stop and even spend 15 minutes in the PEA state, it feels like you're reinflating that energy. The discovery that we made with our neuroimaging studies and our hormonal studies now these studies are all done with 30, 40, 50, 60-year-olds. But it became very clear that you can have this dramatic impact in minutes when you're talking to somebody. But the ability to sustain an effort means that a person has to develop the ability to periodically go back into the PEA. Does that help?
Yeah, I love it. Think about sports teams with a PEA versus an NEA. I mean, you can see a team.
Ted Lasso.
You can see them. Yeah, Ted Lasso is a good example. Yeah. I want to dive in and share some ideas about the impact cycle, our model for change. And I want your candid feedback. Life's too short. I'm getting old. I need to know the truth. But I think you'll see there's a lot of alignment between what you're saying and what we're saying, which is not surprising because I've read a lot of your work. But along the way, we'll probably talk about experimentation, nonlinearity, and other things that are central to your model of change.
Okay.
The impact cycle is a product of about 10 years of research where we use the thing I call lean design research, which is kind of a combination of the book, The Lean Startup, and more design models of change. And so we would work with coaches. They would try it out. They would give us feedback, and then we would make modifications. There's a lot of things we did along the way. So it's now in 3 parts: identify, learn, and improve. And I want to talk about each of those parts and ask you questions along the way. And I'm just so grateful for your feedback. So the identify phase really involves 3 parts. One of them is, where am I now? Second thing is, where do I want to get to? Third thing is, how am I going to get there? Which would be your idea about a learning pathway, a learning direction. And what we have found is most people don't have a very clear picture of reality. It's a little bit like Prochaska's idea of pre-contemplation. That because of defense mechanisms or perceptual errors or the impulse for certainty, when people see themselves on video, for example, they're like, I had no idea it looked like that. And there's a whole host of ways of getting a clear picture of current reality. There's video is really powerful because I'm not giving you feedback. I might give you a tool to help you interpret the video, but you're the one who's making sense of it. but not everybody wants to look at video. We're not going to force it on somebody. So we can interview students and share the interview, or we can run your class and you can interview kids. Or we have a thing called the close watch where the coach teaches the class and the teacher takes time with each student and asks the empathy questions. How's that student feel? How's that student? What's that student need? How do I feel about that student? Where do my emotions come? They might even draw a picture of the child and move to the next kid and think about it. But somehow we want them to get a clear picture of reality. So, and this is my first sort of question you got me thinking about. We think where we start is helping the person. It's not a clear picture of reality. It's just maybe a bigger picture of reality, expanding them. And there's a person who I interviewed a while back who did her dissertation on this work. She said when teachers look at video, it's dramatically different than when they don't look at video in terms of the growth they make and the changes, their motivation to change. So my question is, are we wrong to start with reality, and should we start with an exploration of the ideal self before we look at reality?
Yes.
Kind of the way it looks like in the IC.
Yes. I don't even have to qualify that. There is no condition in which you will invite and motivate a person to pursue change and learning in a sustainable way. I'll have to keep coming back to the sustainable,
Right.
because, look, everybody New Year's Eve says they want to get more fit, so they join a health club. And health club owners love it because, you go for a few weeks and then you stop, but you paid your membership for 6 months or whatever. Starting with reality induces a defensiveness and a guilt.
NEA.
Yeah. And what happens is, even if a person feels, and here's one of the examples, is I think that as soon as you use the words or hear the words should or ought to, you're in the NEA. The person is in the process of closing down. So, yes. Should you flip that order? Definitely. Now, here's the problem. If you flip the order, your tendency, because you've spent these years building this model of, let's make sure people know what's going on, we're going to make you better and it's going to be good. And it's kind of a John Wayne approach to how to make this stuff work. The problem is you're going to keep rushing to get there. So like the conductor trying to do a certain symphonic piece, you're not going to wait till the person's there. When I'm training coaches, what I used to train coaches, now there's a lot of other folks that do this, train coaches in our, or any physicians, teachers, whatever, in our approaches to this. I used to say, if you only had 1 hour to work with somebody, which is of course ridiculous, you always have more time, but if you only had 1 hour, spend 30 minutes on the vision, 20 minutes on their strengths, 5 minutes on a weakness or two, and 5 minutes on the plan, in that sequence. So when I was still coaching, presidents of companies and top executives, they'd come to me with a presenting issue. And I would say, okay, what is that issue? But my rule of thumb, which I actually started saying when I was training therapists in the 70s, I never let people talk about their problem for more than 2 minutes, because they just get sucked into the quicksand of how lousy or how much their work or life sucks. And you're not going to help them after that. You can give them a drink, but you're not going to help them, which doesn't help if they're alcoholics. But anyway, so the dilemma is, as soon as the person does the presenting issue, what I would say literally is, this is important and we'll get to it. But first, I want to understand the big picture of you. I want to understand the context of this thing that you're trying to work on. And the context is, what do you want out of life? And so I start them on a process of reflections. As you know from reading our books, we have a whole bunch of specific exercises. And I never try to give a person more than 1 or 2 exercises a week, because they should spend time reflecting on them. And I'll work with them until they articulate what I call a compelling and comprehensive vision. And what compelling means is, I see in their eyes that they're really excited by this. I mean, this is inspirational. Comprehensive is holistic. Have they included in their dream of what life could be like 15 years from now? Have they included their physical health, their spiritual health, their intimate family relationships, their contributions to the community? And yes, you should include your job and career, but we actually see the job and career as only one part of the whole thing. And if you don't get the whole thing right, the job and career never gets right. So compelling and comprehensive. Now, a person, the older they are, when I was working with the 28 to 30-year-olds, it would take about 4 to 6 weeks for them to write a 3 to 5 page, really exciting vision for themselves and to talk about it with a coach. When I work with my executive doctoral students who average age 50 when they enter, it takes them 6 to 12 months. Because the more successful you are, take that back, the more age and experience you have, regardless of whether you're successful, the more you have what I call ought selves, expectations of others layered on you. And so the older you are, the more the skins you have to peel back from the onion to get to the kernel. And the more you're hearing all these other people's voices in your head about what's going on. So to get to the ideal self takes a long time. I mean, there have been times in which I'll meet with a client. I'm remembering a whole bunch of presidents of companies I was doing that. I'll meet with them once every 2 or 3 weeks. And I might get them to communicate and to share with me a compelling and comprehensive vision in 3 or 4 weeks, but it might take 3 or 4 months. But I will not move on to any other question in the coaching process until I feel we're there. And then even when we're there, every time they come back 2 or 3 weeks later, regardless of where we are, I open the session by saying, update me on, where you are with your vision. Not progress, but have you changed it? I don't do it because I think they changed the vision. I do it because I want them in a PDA state when we start. And if I focus them on a specific goal or a problem, it activates the task positive network in their brain, which stimulates the stress system, the sympathetic nervous system, which moves them to close down, which is the opposite of what I want to do.
So our model as it stands right now is, where am I now? Where do I want to be? How am I going to get there?
Right.
But
And I think my guess is you're getting into the, how do I want to get there too soon as well?
Well, I wanted to say, but it sounds like what you're saying is the starting point is not where am I now. The starting point is who do I want to be?
Yeah. Yes.
And then once I'm who do I want to be, then where am I now?
Yeah. Now, here's the challenge in who do I want to be? As I've said, you have a lot of ought selves. You
Right.
have a lot of social desirability. I mean, so if you're working with teachers, one of the first things is they're supposed to say, I'm tuned into trying to help our students learn. Suppose they don't really give a crap. Suppose they got into teaching because somebody told them they should. The old, oh, you're a woman, you're a girl, you should be a nurse or you should be an elementary school teacher, something like that. I mean, I get a lot of folks that are, in our executive master's programs that are around 40, regardless of whether they're a surgeon or a teacher or a salesperson, who realize they really did it because their parents wanted them to do it. Now they want to do what they want to do in life, which causes significant disruptions unless they're working on it with their partners or spouses and all that. So, yes, I think that you're playing into the social desirability and expectations of others.
So the wonderful. Well, I actually did a study when I was a graduate student on personal vision. It was really fascinating. Person quit because she said, when I think about who I want to be and I think about where I am, it's just too depressing. And I don't want to be in your study anymore. Another one decided that she was spending too much time teaching. She wanted to have children, and she ended up getting pregnant by the end of the study. Another one was a first year teacher, and she said, going back to my ideals, I didn't use ideal self, I used personal vision. I was really influenced by Singhi's fifth discipline and the whole personal mastery and all that stuff. But she said it was my sense of my personal vision that got me through that first year. So it was
Oh yeah, yeah.
very, very,
So let's go back to the first person in your example.
right.
When people are traumatized, you don't get them to embrace the vision or even see it in one setting. That's why I'm saying it could take months,
Right.
because you have to give them very small doses. Um, and the first person, even contemplating it was so frightening. That was NEA, it wasn't PEA, that she just quit the whole process. So part of it is you need to get into the PEA and talking about where you are. Here's an interesting observation that we have from the data. Even if the person is doing really well, talking about where they are stimulates a defensive mode in the brain, in the body.
I would say we need a clear picture of where we are to move forward. We need to understand what's happening and what we're depending on what the goal is, what the
I,
person's trying to
I
pursue.
agree. I didn't say you didn't need it.
Yeah.
I'm saying it's not motivating.
No.
So
Well,
you're using the word need as motive, you might be as motivating. I don't think I say all of our research evidence says it is not motivating.
right.
What it is it helps you figure out what to do. But again, think about this, you know, 30 minutes on the vision, 20 minutes on the strengths, 5 minutes on a weakness.
Yeah. Well, I think, yeah, I'm
And
thinking
we're
now, like,
finding the same thing when we look at teams, organizations, and communities.
right.
And I use the story in the Resonant Leadership book, the 2005 book, as well as in Helping People Change, 2019 book, of Nomusa Zikali, who was asked by the government of South Africa to start an elementary school in between three Zulu villages, the poorest areas and socioeconomic groups in all of South Africa. And they gave her 70 elementary school age children and 4 trees. Well, she built a phenomenal school. And I used her as an example, having met her and just enjoyed this, because she does all of the things that we were talking about that resonant leaders do. She would open every year with a meeting with all of the parents of all of the children, and they'd spend a day talking about what they wanted out of the year, what their vision was, bigger long-term vision for their children, but then what that would mean, what's their dream for the year. And she kept them focused on that, and then used everything from her own Zulu background and understanding the norms in Zulu culture to her sense of humor and her infectious smile. But with the kids, she also would be able to flip into the no nonsense, point to a scrap of paper in the schoolyard, and they would pick it up. So I am not saying that we don't need to know where we are. I'm saying be clear that it's not motivating.
Yeah, that's good.
And that's hard. That's very hard for anybody who builds their models of causality thinking you start there. And another example I'll give you is weighing yourself. Look, I mean, we're an obese country. I mean, the world is obese right now. And we have done a disservice by telling people it's okay to be fat. It's not. We shouldn't shame people, but on the other hand, it is not okay to be fat. Fat people are causing death early. They're leading to very high costs of healthcare, and they're ruining their families because they're getting their children to develop, the wrong eating habits. If you went on any of what used to be the popular weight loss programs, Weight Watchers or Jenny Craig, they would tell you not to weigh yourself every day. They would say, weigh yourself minimum, at the most frequent once a week. Why? Because if you weighed yourself every day, some days you gain weight, some days you lose weight. And if you're trying to do this and you get on the scale and you gain weight, the natural reaction for somebody who's overweight is to say, screw this. And they go for a pint of Chunky Monkey Ben and Jerry's. So the dilemma is, and the same thing with people with high blood pressure. physicians love to say, or nurses, well, monitor your blood pressure every day. What they're not appreciating is the reason there is this thing called white coat syndrome, where people walk into the doctor's office and their blood pressure jumps, especially people with high blood pressure, is they're defensive about it. Well, when you take your blood pressure every day, you're reminding yourself of how bad it is.
I have one more question. We're running out of
Yeah.
time, unfortunately, but and I have a million other questions, but there's one I wanted to zone in on. So I would say the typical model of change in schools with teachers is an expert shows up and says, here's something you should do, and you're expected to implement it. And often there's a lot of talk about fidelity, implement it the way in which the expert said you're supposed to do it. So that's not our way is exactly the opposite. Our way is, let's identify what you want for your kids, and let's try out some things. You help me identify, or you identify what you want to do, and we'll experiment and keep moving forward. So I wondered if you could say just a little bit more about the importance
Sure.
when it comes to change of nonlinearity and experimentation.
First of all, the frame of mind really should start with, what do the kids want to learn? And then what do I think might help them stimulate an approach that would help them learn? So stimulating curiosity is more important than getting them to, kind of do stuff. Now, that doesn't obviate the fact that learning anything involves some hard work. But the success of the Montessori system, not just with children with emotional or behavioral problems, but with children, is a very interesting lesson. The success of the charter schools, when it occurs, because of parental involvement in everything, is a very important message that's a part of my ICT model. So when I start to think about it, I mean, I quoted in the 2019 book, I'm forgetting the author's name, but that works that she did in education, where she got the students to write out, what do I want my teacher to know, which they never got a chance to talk about. That starts with them. I mean, I do this with professors of graduate schools. I get them to stop thinking about program innovation or how to create new master's programs. I start, what are our students learning? What do you want our students to be learning? And so that focusing on the other ends up being important. This notion of, the expert comes in and says, this is what's good for you, as I said, is a part of a political ideology that says there is an elite who knows better, and they're telling you because, you're too ignorant or whatever. We're all capable of getting in touch with our needs. Now, it doesn't mean that our needs and everybody's wants is okay, because that leads to chaos as well. The social responsibility and all those kinds of things. So I think, and very often, an inspired teacher will understand that a particular child is stuck in their process of exploration. So we didn't get into what's a part of your second phase of your model, but I would say the most important part of a person entering a process of learning and change is novelty, is for them to think of it as experimentation. I was saying to you earlier, after 60 years of lapse, I'm back into studying jazz guitar and wanting to really get good at it. And during the first course, it took me 6 weeks before my fingers stopped being on fire. And and these online courses have a live session 1 hour a week, and with one of the professional guitarists who's one of their senior faculty at Berkeley. And one of the things that this fellow Bruce said in that first course to each one of us, he said, when you're practicing and getting ready to submit the 2 video assignments each week, he said, stop working at it so hard. You're making it worse. Play with it. Try it out. Explore it. He said, you still have to do it, and you have to repeat it, and you have to keep going over things. But if you start with it being, oh my God, this is going to be horrible, you're not going to get there. he was right, because what he was saying is, remember why you're doing this. You want the joy of music.
Right.
You don't want to get technically good. And very often for most of us, it's the exploration or the try it out that helps to lower the tension level, the expectation level. And I think that as you go to your third phase of this improve, um, the same thing applies, that you want people to be aware of how they're improving, but each moment, it's got to be in the context of their vision, not their goals, because the goals will focus them on how much they're not improving. But the vision will say, okay, why did I get into this thing? I got into it because I wanted to be able to hear the difference. Or in teaching, I got into this not to teach this course. I got into this because I want that moment in which that student's eyes twinkle and they say, oh my God, that's what this is about. And that might happen in the first week or the 8th week or the 16th week, or it might not happen till 2 years after my course is over and they call me back and say, now I got it. But that's what keeps you going.
So I'm wondering, is there anything else you want to say about what you know about change and how it applies to what's happening in schools today? How you see what's happening in schools today?
There are two things that we tend to not think about as much as we should, that are both a part of intentional change theory. One of them is the importance of resonant relationships, caring relationships. And we set out just about 20 years ago to start measuring this. And we actually have now over 50 studies, most of which are published, showing that when you're in sync with somebody else, that's what we call a resonant relationship,
Right.
that you have a shared vision, shared compassion and caring, and shared mindfulness. And when the culture allows it, shared playfulness. The key is that very often those of us in the helping professions are so focused on the other that we don't realize that it's our relationship with them and the authenticity that we have in it that not only feeds them, but feeds us.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea of whether it's a teacher or whatever, thinking that, they're teaching this classroom of kids, they really have to think about the fact that if they have 30 kids in the classroom, they have 30 pair relationships that are key.
Mm.
Okay, so the relationships is a key part of ICT. Another key part of ICT is the multi-level. You are never going to help an individual change if you don't help the groups or systems that they're a part of change. I mean, I knew that when I was working with alcoholics and drug addicts. I mean, if you didn't get their family back working or find a new family and work with the people they're working with, they'd be back drinking or using in a few months. Schools, every headmaster or headmistress knows that if they work regularly with all of the parents, the children learn more. Schools are not just for the teacher and the children. The parents are a key part of the system. The parents' social systems are a key part of it. For the teachers, I mean, that's why I think of all the things in education, the one intervention that worked best was school-based education. And part of that was to realize that each school is a social system unto itself. It's like a ship in the Navy. Once it's at sea, it's a whole thing. And most of the time, the reason teachers lose their motivation is because of lousy management and leadership. So the multi-level aspect of it means we've got to work on multiple levels if we want to get change. Now, what do I think has happened with education? I think that because of all this stuff, we had the self-esteem movement, which I thought was absolute crap, and that led to Lake Wobegon, where all the children are above average, and a whole generations of entitled brats, where they sue their college professor because they got a C. So I think that was misdirected. Roy Baumeister said we should have been teaching emotional self-control, and I agree with him, according to the data. I also think that we very often in education focus a little too much on the content of the material and not the style of people acquiring the material. So knowledge by itself is useless and it's quickly forgotten. Learning knowledge and then using it is key. Any of us who learn a language know that if you don't regularly use the new language, you quickly forget your verb tenses. And I think that the field of education has been driven by a lot of that stuff. Tests are the worst way to evaluate somebody's learning because tests cause people to cram, and cramming increases the dump rate. We've shown that in research, not us, but others who study this. So, I mean, if you want to know whether or not somebody's learning something, give them a chance to use the learning in a real setting. It's called in the field of evaluation performance assessment. And that's the outcome that we're after. We're after an outcome in education where people are curious, and we're trying to do it in such a way that people develop these skills of, math and reading and things like that. But, there's a French poet and philosopher or writer, Anton de Saint-Exupéry, had this great quote, which I used in The Science of Change, that if you want to build a ship, don't bring people together and collect wood and assign them tasks and things to do. Teach them to long for the immensity of the sea. And that's the thing that I think the system of education has gotten us to very often lose sight of what we're trying to do. Social emotional learning. Castle at the University of Chicago has shown that 3 to 18 hours during a whole year will improve the number of students who stay in school, reduce the number of absences, even increase their scores on standardized tests. How? Because the emotional noise going on in kids' heads, whether they're 5 years old or 18 years old, is noise that clouds all the rest of the signals. And yet, very often, especially in our public school systems, people aren't encouraged to spend their time working on that.
When you talk about resonance, you talked about purpose, caring, and maybe playfulness, but what did I miss?
Mindfulness.
That comes after caring, mindfulness. I mean, I know it's
Yeah. So it was vision, shared compassion, shared mindfulness were the main three. And the mindfulness means tuning into. And it's not being self-centered,
No.
which too many people use as a lever, but it's really being tuning into yourself, the other people, your natural environment, etc.
It seems to me, I don't want to keep you here, but it seems to me that the shoulds and the oughts lead people to want to focus on behavior without attention to what's happening inside. So they're going through emotions, but they're not having an authentic experience.
An exercise I use in every lecture, every speech I give, and it's been in most of my books, is, and I do this, if you keep this in the podcast, I'd ask your listener to do this exercise. Think about who helped you become who you are in your whole life, not just work. Think back and write down a bunch of names. I'll usually wait 30, 60 seconds. Then go back to the first person who you thought of and remember a moment with them in which you learned something important. And just write a few notes to remember what went on, like you're playing the video. Then do it for the second person. When we started posing that question and interviewing adults for 2 to 3 hours about all those incidents in 2000, we discovered that 80 to 100% of all the stories come back that it started in the positive emotional attractor. I mean, most people will think of one of their parents or grandparents. A lot of people will think of a teacher.
Mm-hmm.
I myself dedicated, one of the people I dedicated the Science of Change to was Max Boyson, who was my high school physics teacher. He I mean, we were a bunch of nerds in our, class, and it was a public school system, but because we had part of an Air Force base and a county hospital, a county jail, and we had a lot of money, so we had phenomenal teachers. He offered a group of us in our junior year, finishing the first course in physics, a second year of physics if we wanted it. It was the beginning of the AP movement. We jumped at the chance. He opened up the second year, but he had us work over the summer, volunteer to clean up a basement room in the high school because he bought some equipment. And what we did is the whole second year of physics by redoing basic experiments. So the first one was to calculate the gravitational constant, the capital G. So we went in and did the experiment that Isaac Newton did. 2 weeks. We read about it, did all the studies, measured all this. There were 6 of us. And at the end, we came out with a number that by the 4th decimal point differed from what was in the textbooks. So we were sitting there thinking, it's typical high school kids. Oh my God, we screwed up. He's going to yell at us. He listens to our presentation and he said, I've told you that sometimes a naive observer in science can see something that other people can't. He said, I know some physics professors at Columbia, and I know a few physics professionals, physicists at Brookhaven National Labs. He said, what I'll do is I will call each of them and set up a meeting where we can visit them and you can present your findings. And we said, oh, that'd be fantastic. He said, but it's going to take me a few weeks to set this up. During the next 2 weeks, I want you to redo the study. Because remember, we talked about in science, replication is important. We said, sure. We're sitting there saying, oh my God, we redid what Sir Isaac Newton did, and we found a mistake. We were charged up. We couldn't wait for other classes to get over, to get run down to the basement. We did a whole week focusing on redoing the study. In the second week, we presented to Mr. Boyson the results. And what we found was the textbooks were correct, that we'd made a measurement error. But in the process, we had 3 weeks of absolutely driven excitement about science. That is the kind of thing. So when you say who helped you, that's where those of us who are teachers have impact on people that last their lives, may have impact on people that last their lives. And that's what we aspire to. So in my talks, I will ask people at a certain point, whose list will you be on, as a way to rekindle that aspiration.
I love it. I think it's wonderful. And man, you just slowed up my rewriting of that book process so much by this conversation. Now I got a ton of work to have to get
But remember why you're doing it, though, Jim. Remember why you're doing it.
I know.
You're doing it because you want to help people with these big breakthroughs.
That's right. Right. No, it's actually been just so wonderful to talk with you. And there's so many things that we could talk more about, but we probably better bring it to a close. But Richard, I just loved our conversation so much. It's been extremely helpful to me. And you're inspiring. Maybe I can learn how to play guitar. Maybe I need to get my act together and make it happen. But I really recommend this book. I like all of your books, but The Science of Change. Oh, I mentioned Primal Leadership. I mean, they're both really important books. And but the
Primal Leadership is written for practitioners. Even Helping People Change is written for practitioners. The Science of Change is written for scholars and advanced professionals, because it really it doesn't use story-based logic. It uses research evidence. Right. So it's a more difficult book to read in that sense, but it serves a different part of the audience.
Yeah, but I like the way the 10 principles are laid out.
Thank you.
That's really, really helpful. But Primal Leadership will have anybody be a better leader, I think, in my opinion. Anyway, right. I'm so grateful for you. Hold on for a second. We'll chat, but thank you so much for being a part of the podcast. I know how busy you are, and it means a lot that you could make time for us. So thank you.
Thank you for the conversation.